is the most fun I've ever had making anything. That production was on the brink of imploding. And to kind of lean into that side of the genre was a new thing for me. That was the hardest period of my whole life.
Mike Flanagan is almost undeniably horror's most imaginative director right now. He's given us pure creeping fear in Hush, surreal dread in Gerald's Game, and invoked just about every fright imaginable in the course of The Haunting of Hill House. Not to mention earned the personal blessing of Stephen King along the way. But his journey to the top of the profession has been a long one, and occasionally a horror story in its own right. With his latest creation, The Haunting of Bly Manor, about to arrive on Netflix, we took the chance to sit down with Flanagan and get him to talk us through every professional project in his career from beginning to end, telling his story in his own words. This is a director's journey to become the new king of horror.
Absentia was really kind of created out of desperation, actually. I was working as a reality TV editor. I had found out I was going to have a child, and I felt like if I didn't do something soon, I may never have a chance to kind of break in as a director. And so we crowdfunded it on Kickstarter, which was still kind of in its beta testing phase at the time. And we shot it in my apartment for nothing. It was a crew of like 8 people. I think of that as this incredible kind of ridiculous DIY project that was really about not wanting to kind of spend the rest of my life cutting a TV on a night shift. What I learned from it was the importance of painting a picture in the imagination of a viewer, as opposed to showing something explicitly. It was an incredible lesson in how to kind of provide the ingredients to a viewer that they could use to frighten themselves, because we couldn't afford to show anything. I mean, our monster in that movie, we used 2 twigs and a leather coat that we flapped in front of the lens, and that was all we had. Oculus was the first legitimate movie in a lot of ways. I think with that film, I learned how to work with a crew. I was among the least experienced people on that set. I was surrounded by professionals, a lot of whom I still work with to this day. You know, I met a lot of people on that movie who ended up being my family and ended up kind of becoming this team of collaborators that has now moved with me from project to project. I remember feeling so lucky to be there every day that I felt like it could go away at any moment. Like, Oculus was this kind of surreal feeling that I finally was doing everything that I'd wanted to do for kind of my whole life. And if I messed up, I might not ever have another chance, you know, to do it. So I was scared a lot of the time. It's strange because the next movie that I actually made was Before I Wake. It was stuck in distribution limbo for so long that a lot of people kind of put it later in my timeline, but we did it right after Oculus, and before Oculus had even been released, we were making that movie. And that one I remember as being cursed. I loved it for all the reasons that it ended up being problematic to market. I loved it because it wasn't really a horror film. I loved it because it had this what I thought was a very sweet kind of fairy tale. It had this like gooey center that I really liked. As a follow-up to Oculus, which I thought was a very bleak movie, as much fun as I had doing it, it's a pretty cynical film. This was the other side of that coin. This was really, really hopeful. And you know, we had this unknown kid, Jacob Tremblay, who it turned out was about to be very, very known. We felt like we had this big discovery with him, and I was working with Tom Jane, who I kind of idolized from The Mist and from 61 and Boogie Nights, and Kate Bosworth, and kind of everything went wrong. I had kind of lost sight of some of the lessons from Absentia, and we were trying to show entirely too much. The ambition for what we wanted to create rather than what we wanted to imply ended up hurting the film. When the film was finished, it was all set for this big wide release. It was going to be this wonderful theatrical follow-up to Oculus, and then Relativity Media went bankrupt. And the whole film just fell off a cliff. And for years it was trapped. And I thought for a long time it was never going to come out. And while that happened, I was just kind of treading water. And that's why Hush happened. So Hush came about because of Kate, really. We were dating, and we went out to dinner, and Kate said, I've always wanted to have a kind of challenge as an actor where some major tool from my toolkit would be removed. And I said, well, wow, I've always really wanted to do a film without dialogue. And especially after Before I Wake, which I'd kind of agonized over what I hoped was this very kind of poetic, very talky, dialogue-heavy movie, and it hadn't worked. I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to just go back to pure cinema and pure visual storytelling? In order for Kate to write it with me and for Kate to star in it, we had to scale it as far down as we could so that someone would take a chance on it. That was Trevor Macy and Jason Blum, who came in to finance the movie for a fraction of what we'd had to make Before I Wake and Oculus without a distributor. And kind of that was the closest to Absentia. It was, back to a very small crew in the woods all night long. And so Hush for me was pure. It kind of stripped away a lot of the entanglements that had kind of dragged Before I Wake down. So Ouija Origin of Evil is the most fun I've ever had making anything. It was one of the strangest jobs where, I'd worked now with Blumhouse on Oculus because they had come on to that when we had sold the film. They had co-produced Hush, and, they had this sequel to Ouija because Ouija had performed really, really well, and nobody could kind of understand it. It was like, well, it performed well enough that there should be another one, and they brought it to me, and my initial response was, no, I don't want to do a sequel. Jason Blum basically said, I want to support you creatively. Like, what's something you'd love to do that nobody else will let you do? And I said, I'd love to do a true period piece about a single mom in the late 60s, and focus a lot on kind of fraudulent spiritualism. And he was like, sure, do that. And then, the only caveat is you've got to kind of dovetail it into this other movie. The expectations creatively for the film were pretty low, so I got to just play. A lot of by this point, my real family of crew, we all got to kind of look at it together and say, like, all right, well, what's something we've always wanted to do and no one will let us do? What are the kind of movies we remember falling in love with in the 70s and in the 80s when we were kids that made us love horror cinema? And we would talk about The Changeling and Something Wicked This Way Comes and Watcher in the Woods, and down to the little cigarette burns on the Real Changes, in the theaters. It was like, how do we recreate that experience if this is a movie for teenagers? God, we had fun. We had an antique lens package. We were using, toys that had completely fallen out of vogue. We were breaking out the split diopters. It was all about long zooms instead of dolly or Steadicam. We were talking about how to add grain to the whole thing to really just kind of give it this vintage feel. My memory of being on set on that film was just laughter. Gerald's Game was my dream movie. That was the movie that I'd wanted to make since I was like 19 years old. And it all kind of happened because of Hush, because Stephen King saw Hush. It created bonds that I'll have for the rest of my life with Carla Gugino and with Bruce Greenwood and Henry Thomas, and Kate was in there too. And those are people I will always work with because of what we went through on Gerald's Game. We had cast another actress to play Jessie, and 2 weeks before we started shooting, she dropped out. The panic of that whole sense that, like, yes, half my life I've been wanting to make this film, and it's about to completely just detonate. And Carla was a last-minute addition, and she came into a scenario where the rest of the cast was panicked, and I was panicked, and the crew was panicked, and the whole thing looked like it was about to just, we were gonna pack up and leave. And we would have left so much money on the ground that we'd already kind of spent, we never would have gotten the film back up on its feet. And Carla came in and galvanized everyone. She pulled the cast together, she pulled the crew together. She kind of got me out of this paralysis of panic that I was in and was able to focus on the work again. And man, I was proud of that movie. It felt a lot like Absentia in that we didn't have any resources. We'd kind of spent everything we had to get to the first day of production. And then everything after that was just a scramble. That film was the most personal and kind of the most harrowing thing that I'd ever done. And that was the one where when I finished it, kind of for the first time, I felt like if this all goes away right now, like I got to do that. So The Haunting, it was another one of those projects I never really thought would happen. I love the book. I've loved the book since I was a kid. And I didn't know how or why you would do that and how that story could ever kind of expand into a television format. And I'd never done TV before. I pitched it as kind of a follow-up to Oculus. It's really, I had said at one point it's Oculus, but it goes to 11. It's generational trauma and two timelines braided together, and siblings dealing with something that may or may not have, destroyed their parents, and it's Oculus. And I pitched it as a 10-hour movie. And then kind of every weird idea that I'd ever had watching other television shows just popped up. And I was like, an episode like the episode The Body of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Boy, that'd be cool. Wouldn't it be cool if we did an episode that looked like it was one shot? I bet that would be really neat. And so these were all initially very casual ideas. And it turned into this kind of locomotive that completely took over my life. That was the hardest period of my whole life, making that show. I lost 45 pounds in production. It's 100 days of production. It basically doubled my entire career output in one sitting. For me, and for certainly a lot of the members of the cast, it almost killed us. I'm not being colorful about that. Like, I really felt like it almost killed us. It was emotionally a devastating experience. So much, it turns out, so much of kind of the story of my extended family and of death and loss within my family and within my parents' families had kind of infiltrated this story. I had no idea how personal I'd let it become until we were shooting it. I wasn't there to see kind of this moment where the show was released and suddenly there was this huge kind of swelling of attention on it because I was shooting Dr. Sleep. So Dr. Sleep is by far the biggest thing I've ever done. Kind of stepping into these two huge shadows, being Kubrick and King. It kind of let me dig back into each of the films that we were talking about today. Every one of them has an element, has a note that's kind of part of the song of Dr. Sleep. In ways I didn't really even expect. They all led to this in a really clear way for me. This film, more than any of the others, is probably the most complex, and it required the most out of us. I think I felt up to it, in a way that I hadn't in a while. I kind of came into it calm and feeling pretty clear-eyed. And I had the support of Stephen King, which again, every time I say stuff like that out loud, is just like, ugh, it's crazy. I had, by this point, a family in my crew who have been with me through so much. And I had a cast that's really second to none. And a lot of them are familiar, a lot of them are kind of part of my cast family. And the new people who came in, Ewan and Rebecca and Kylie, came in and kind of looked around and realized it's like, oh my God, yeah, I'm stepping into a production family here. And they embraced that. And so there was a sense on Dr. Sleep that kind of all the lessons of the other movies were coming to bear, and we'd all kind of graduated to it together.